So welcome, Lauren and Emily. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Susan. Lauren, it's so great to be here with you. Um, I think we were planning as we got started today, just sort of briefly talking a little bit about what our books were about and why we got interested in writing them. Always sort of the first questions that are on people's minds. Lauren, do you want to start and then I'll go?
Sure, I can start. So my book, Fear of the Family, I don't know how left and right works, but there we go. My book is about family migration. So I was really interested in this because this is the predominant legal pathway that people kind of take into most states in the world today. The vast majority of legal migration across borders happens through being a family member of somebody who's already on the other side of that border. And so I was really interested in this as this kind of form of migration. And I decided that looking really in depth at how the family worked in West German migration policy would be a good way to kind of understand not just challenges facing Germany today, but really any state that has a migration regime. Because any state that has a migration regime uses family as a sorting category for who gets to cross borders legally. And it turns out that it's a much more complicated category than I had anticipated when I started the book. So that was kind of how I came to my topic. How did you come to Muslims in the making of modern Europe?
Yeah, so I was trained as a Yugoslav historian, and as I was finishing my first book on Sarajevo in World War II, I also had a lot of interesting questions that were related to law. Particularly, I came across a set of documents where communist judges were thinking about and utilizing Sharia law, Islamic law, in developing their cases and their strategies. And I started to ask questions of how, first of all, why don't we know this story? There was Sharia law in the middle of communist Eastern Europe. But then I also wanted to make sense of sort of what the background of that story was and how we got to a place and what it looked like. And so I started working on the book actually almost in backwards. So it began in the post-World War period where your book begins chronologically, but then I started sort of peeling back the layers to try to figure out where the beginning of the story was. And I settled on 1878, which was the Congress of Berlin. And so the book it's sort of a collective history of several generations of Muslims from 1878 until the late 1940s, early 1950s in Southeastern Europe. And it shows how sort of these generations of Muslims that were absorbed by different European states sort of responded to that process and shaped projects of citizenship and law and policy and education. So different part of Europe from where you are, but I think also equally important.
If I can follow up on that, I was reading your book, and I think that is one of the things that brings our books together. They're both about people using law creatively in a lot of ways, and kind of using law in ways that I think the states that they're in don't expect them to. Which is a nice little story of resistance that I think happens with both of our books, and legal pluralism and legal creativity. But I was really struck in part of your book, you mentioned that you kind of came to this project thinking you were working on Muslims in Yugoslavia. And then while you were doing the research, you realized that your subjects never would have thought of themselves as Muslims in Yugoslavia. And that is not how they would have framed the story. And I was curious, can you say more about that? Like, how do you think your subjects actually would have framed their story if they could title your book? And thankfully, our subjects don't get to title our books. But if they could have titled your book, would they have actually titled it Muslims in the Making of Modern Europe? Or would they have picked something entirely different?
Yeah, it's a great question. So that was really an intellectual epiphany for me. It actually was triggered by this Ottoman colleague of mine, Lala John, at City College of New York, where I used to teach. And she sort of was like, what happens to your story if you start your narrative, start your chapters from the perspective of Muslims and not from states? I'm like, well, of course, right? I mean, like, isn't that where the field of history is going? But it made me realize that it's not just about the way we tell a history, but actually about sort of the historical framing itself. And so, many of my subjects I open one chapter with Abdullah, who's given citizenship in Montenegro in the 1880s. And I talk about how, we have this idea that, oh, wow, he's given citizenship. That's great, right? But he doesn't want citizenship. He doesn't see himself as a Montenegrin. And citizenship comes with all of these obligations of taxes and fighting in an army and sending your kids to school. And so this notion that, we have these narratives of moving in one direction, that, moving towards citizenship is not necessarily the best way to think about it. And I think a better way, and the Muslims who are at the center of my story are thinking about it, is really the shattering of an Ottoman imperial world, and then the remaking of something new. And I think so the making in the title tries to do a number of different things, but part of it is, what does it mean to make a state and a society after the Ottoman Empire? What does it mean for a group of people who used to be kind of the political and economic elite and are now marginalized? And how do they understand that legal project? So that was, but how would they call it? That's a really great question. I don't know. I mean, even some of the language we use, and I'd be really curious to hear how you think about this language also. But, I struggled with the idea of, is this conquest, right? Is it, Balkan historical narratives might view it as independence or liberation, right? Or we have narratives of occupation, but, what words do we use, and how do we define those narratives through our sources? What about you with your title? I was sort of thinking as I read your book that it also could have so many different titles. And there's obviously fear of the family, but I also thought that at different points it could be fear of the foreigner. How would your subject sort of think about the title, and how did you come to understanding this book? Like, did you begin the book from a place of the family as the center, as you just were talking a little bit about, or from the fear as the center?
That's a good question. I started the book with the family at the center. I'm quite certain of that. The fear was definitely what came later. But so, yeah, if you know one sentence about guest worker migration to Germany, it's Max Frisch's sentence, "We called for workers, but people came."
Which I teach in one of my lectures. When I got to that, I was like, excellent. Now I have a chapter to assign with that lecture.
Excellent. And yeah, so one of my first findings actually while I was working on this was that we mostly misquote that sentence because we leave out the first half of it. And so the first half of it is actually, a small master race feels itself in danger. Workers were called for and people came. So by taking out the small master race feels itself in danger part, we're missing two things that I really try to bring back into the story. One is race and racialization. The word small master race is very purposefully chosen when Max Frisch writes that sentence. And he's trying to call attention to the fact that racial thinking is happening here. And then two, we miss the deep emotion. It's not just that they're annoyed that people came or displeased, it's that they feel themselves in danger. And so it became really clear that there was a fear of people being more than workers as they migrated across borders that really motivated a lot of what the state was doing as it sought to manage migratory flows in my work. And then I actually found Helmut Schmidt, the Chancellor of West Germany for a portion of the book, saying in a call to the president of the European Economic Community, "I'm not afraid of foreigners. I'm afraid of families of foreigners." And so I was like, great.
There we are.
There we are. You're afraid of families of foreigners. Kind of how can I unpack this?
Yeah.
And so the title, I like the title. I think the title encapsulates the argument of the book pretty nicely. But I do think it leaves out the fact that the state is afraid of the family, but because the state is afraid of the family, those families are constantly living in fear, right? And so a lot of the book is about how do people respond to deportations of members of their family? How do families feel when they're crossing the border and they know that their claim to being a family might be challenged? And so fear kind of the family really creates fear within these foreign families. And that's the part of the book that the title maybe doesn't encapsulate as nicely.
Oh, I think it does actually, because I think that it's nice to have these words and concepts that can kind of be looked at in different ways. I was just talking earlier today about the making, right, in my title, and how it's simultaneously about sort of Muslims making something, but also Europe being made. And I think sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of that ambiguity where we can kind of read into it in multiple layers. So. But something you were just saying really struck me, because while I was reading your book, I often think about sort of how we go from 19th century sort of imperial thought and civilizing rhetoric and sort of early Orientalist ideologies to kind of your story, and also the story of sort of contemporary xenophobia and Islamophobia in Europe, right? And we have these centuries, and as historians, we often tend to work on one section rather than thinking through it, all. But I felt like one of the really powerful parts of your book was how you make us really reflect on the fact that sort of racial politics they don't just disappear. They are reconstituted into something else. And specifically in your book, you show how in the wake of Nazism, these ideas need to go somewhere, right? Nazi ideology is not palatable anymore. We have denazification. But it's sort of slowly over time, it seems to become sort of integrated into concepts of migrants and foreigners and guest workers and Muslims. And so I guess my question is sort of how much of the sort of Nazi ideology do you see in the ways that, what is that process? Could you talk to us a little bit about how do we get to this kind of racialized idea of the foreigner? And is it sort of specific, do you think, in the German context? Or is it, could we find similarities, for example, in the French context?
Great question. Yeah, I have two thoughts about that. So one is about the Nazi ideologies and their kind of legacies. One of my favorite archives to work with for the book was the archive of the Association of German Women Married to Foreigners, who still exists today. They've changed their name many times since they were the Association of German Women Married to Foreigners. But their archives I worked with for the book, and they started because their husbands were getting deported, and they thought, why are our husbands not protected from deportation by being married to us German women? And they immediately drew this connection to Nazi ideologies that were against mixture, that were against intermarriage to foreigners. And so in their kind of activist work, they were constantly drawing this Nazi parallel and kind of throwing up Nazi laws against mixed marriages and comparing it to the way that West Germany was treating them and their husbands. And so it was their kind of activist archive that made me really think about, well, how are these Nazi-like ideas getting recast in a language more compatible with like post-1945 liberalism and ideas of human rights? So that's one part of that answer. And then questions of like, how do we compare this to France and other contexts? Again, in France and Britain as well in this period, the migrants who are of concern to the state come from colonial possessions and decolonizing countries. And so the way that that's talked about is a story about post-colonialism and kind of the end of empire. In my case, the migrants who they're concerned about are coming from other countries in Europe, Spain, Italy, Yugoslavia, Turkey. And so the way that they're taught, there's still hierarchies and there's kind of intra-European hierarchies, but they're not within this kind of explicitly imperial and post-imperial language, which made it surprising how many times they were looking to Britain and France and borrowing things Britain and France were doing for the German context. So it actually showed how kind of these ideas can get passed around, even if you're in a different legal context. If I can kind of ask you a question then, I really was struck by something you said about making. And I wonder if your subjects would call your book like Unmaking Ottoman unmaking the Ottoman Empire, more than making modern Europe in certain points. But I was really struck by it because your first book is like this tight study of this place in 4 years, a very eventful 4 years, 1941 to 1945. And in this book, you really took us from the 1870s all the way to the 1950s. And I'm wondering, kind of first, what challenges did you have in narrating this story across a very eventful 70 years for your people, I would say? And then what kind of conventional periodizations of European history do you think you upset the most by looking at it from the perspective of these Muslim communities?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I didn't set out to write a book that was this long period of time. As I said at the outset, when I began, at first I thought it was like a post World War II book, and then I thought it was a 1918 to early socialist period book, and then I realized no, this book is actually about it's a post Ottoman story, and to do it right, it needs to be done over the long durée. And the biggest challenge was deciding sort of when to stop doing research and how to include things and write things comparatively. Because, I work with certain languages and not with others. And so I had to make choices. And I think it's the kind of thing where when you go big, at least chronologically, but also regionally, you can end up just in this endless research project. And I wanted to be able to find enough similarities in different places to be able to say, this is not just a Yugoslav story. It's not just a Habsburg story. It's not just a Serbia story. These are ways we see things across multiple states, big states, small states, states in transition, new states, old states. But I'm not going to do all the states. Right? And I didn't want it to be also in part because I didn't want it to be state driven. I didn't want to have and here's our chapter on, the Kingdom of Serbia, and here's our chapter on Austria-Hungary. And so I really wanted to kind of make it an integrated narrative where I drew upon examples from different places, and the kind of Muslim-centered approach to writing helped with that because so many people were between states or didn't see the states as legitimate. And so I could kind of think through those themes. I think that the biggest periodizations that I've tried to sort of challenge are predominantly 1918, which is a big historical, we're in the middle of a historiographical trend right now to say, wait a second, 1918, we always had this idea that it was a rupture between empires and nation states and the beginning of the 20th century, and all these institutes of contemporary Europe start in 1918, and the Journal of Contemporary European History, which I was one of the editors for, starts in 1918. And I'm like, wait a second, these lines that we've drawn really don't make sense, right? There are Ottoman legacies and continuities that are happening well into the 1920s. I mean, there are people in Yugoslavia who are still writing in Ottoman Turkish in the late 1920s, right? Even after Ottoman Turkish is not really used in Turkey. And likewise, there's sort of these things that kind of go backward that we understand as part of sort of the nation state moment. But in fact, Serbia was a nationalizing state in 1878. And so in both directions, we have this sort of, I think, false idea of these what constitutes the 19th century and what constitutes the 20th. The other periodization that I really try to think through and challenge a bit is the early communist period and what that looked like. And how sort of questions of minority rights and religious and confessional rights were understood in the early socialist period, and whether we can actually see kind of 45 as a concrete marker, or whether we kind of need to think more broadly about how the late 40s and early 50s are again part of an earlier story. What about you in terms of your periodization and sort of thinking through, because you also cover many decades and think through the second half of the 20th century. Were there particular challenges to that, or were there particular kind of periodization moments that you wanted to challenge or that you were surprised to challenge?
Sure. So I think the biggest division in looking at guest worker history in West Germany has always been this 1973 recruitment stop. And there was this kind of narrative that was before 1973, they were workers. And then after 1973, they were families. And that's when the problem started. And that was the kind of simplistic narrative that I really wanted to push back on by really looking at the family in detail. And I quickly found out one thing that really surprised me is that family migration started way before 1973. And it started because employers love employing lots of people from the same family. So there were actually all these moments in the as early as the early 1960s where the countries of Yugoslavia and Turkey and Spain are saying, hey, we don't actually want full families to go abroad. We don't like the fact that entire families are leaving our countries and resettling in Germany. But German employers are so keen to employ entire families at once that it's actually employers who kind of start family migration and full family settlement into Germany. So that was really shocking for me because then in the 70s and 80s, there's so much complaint from the state about how did these families get here? And the answer is in many cases because you let employers employ entire families and significantly accelerate the process of family settlement beyond what it would have been without that explicit preference for employing entire families.
Mhm.
Right, because the nice thing about when you employ an entire family is you do not have to pay them all the same wages because you can assume that one of them is the secondary earner. And so it's really this insatiable demand for cheap foreign female labor significantly accelerates family settlement like well before 1973.
So I love the part of your book where you talk about sort of this sort of tension over realizing they want foreign women because there's like almost a fear of miscegenation, and there's a fear that these foreign men are going to marry German women. And I remember there's like a magazine cover that I've taught that has this image of like the woman marrying the Mohammedan in Germany in the 1960s. And so I wonder, at what point in this narrative, as you sort of disrupt it, does that sort of fear of the foreigner sort of invading the German nation kind of play up? Is that before the 73 break or after the 73 break?
It's always kind of there, I would
Mhm.
say. But I think it changes in its precise nature over time. And I think also the understanding of like, our families little containers. So I think in the 60s, there's almost this understanding that if you have an entire family, there'll be a nice contained whole that will do their family things in their family and then be equally easy to move back to Turkey or
Mhm.
Italy or wherever. And it's really only over time that the state comes to realize that families actually aren't nicely little neatly contained packages that remain in the exact same shape all the time. And that kind of family migration actually leads to more change than the state had anticipated. When the state kind of first allows family migration, it really is under this assumption that families are less disruptive to German social life than single men.
Mhm.
And so again, I think I don't want to go too close to the contemporary thing, but if we think about like refugee resettlement policies today too, there's often a fear of single men and this idea that women can work to contain single men in
Mhm.
ways that the state might see as desirable. But then those women actually may have their own ideas about how they want to use family migration that the state may not love. And that I think is like the story of the second half of my book.
Yeah, no, that's great. It actually, I mean, as you're talking, it's making me think also of sort of this idea of when and how people become citizens. And, in Southeastern Europe, as I talk about in my book, it's sort of imposed upon states by the great powers at treaties where they're required to give citizenship to all men, regardless of religion, which is not something that they're doing in other parts of Europe, right? The French Empire requires Muslims in many places to renounce Islam in order to be a citizen. The British Empire doesn't have equal citizenship laws for all of its constituents. And so we have this sort of kind of question of political belonging that is changing. And I'm sort of tracing it in the 19th and 20th centuries and how it's changing vis-a-vis Muslims and how their perceptions of it are changing. But one of the things I noticed in your book is that, it continues to change, and it especially changed. And again, because I was thinking about Muslims in particular, it especially changes after the formation of the EU, where this question of citizenship doesn't seem as critical anymore to people from, as you said, Italy or Yugoslavia or Spain, especially as countries sort of become part of the EU. And after 89, even, that extends to places like Croatia. I mean, not right away, but eventually. And I'm wondering if there's something then that kind of emerges in a particular kind of citizenship discourse around the Muslim guest worker. There were a number of your cases, the women who were married to guys in Iraq or Iran, or from those places. I think you have somebody from Egypt, right? The common denominator struck me as, these were all places also where the men were likely Muslim. And so I'm wondering, sort of in this narrative, is there sort of a narrative of Muslim political belonging that sort of is layered onto the migration narrative?
I think there is. And I want to ask you a question about citizenship after this, but I'll answer your question first. I was really, again, kind of coming into this because kind of contemporary German political discourse often focuses on Islam as a problem for the German nation. I really expected to find that in the archives, and I did. But I was shocked to find that the first men who civil registrars didn't want to marry into the German nation were not Muslims, but were Catholics, Catholics from Franco's Spain. So kind of the very first case I found where a civil registrar refused to marry a German woman to a foreign man was a foreign man from Franco's Spain.
Fascinating.
And in that case, it was the problem of kind of ecclesiastical Catholic law coming into the German nation.
But there are Catholics in Germany. I mean,
there are many Catholics. Germany is half Catholic at this point, right?
So it's like it's a strange.
But so you actually. So I was surprised by how different the Mediterranean kind of countries were seen to be in the 1960s, and how, as European integration happened, those differences came to be seen as less salient, even though they had been really salient at a time within living memory. And Islam became this kind of increasingly salient difference. But people weren't talking a lot about Islam in the 1960s, and they really start to after the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and in the 1980s with the rise of a politicized Islam globally. And then, yes, you do see a lot of concern about Islam within kind of state archives and how that reverberates in the lives of individuals. One more thing about Europe that I found really interesting while writing the book was that the thing that being in Europe lets you do is move back and forth and kind of be a transnational border crossing family. And you see this increasingly, that kind of, because Italians are in the European Economic Community the whole time, they're very likely to move their children back and forth so that their children can learn 2 languages and so that their children will have connections in both places. But as the border kind of hardens to places that are outside of that European circle, Turkish parents can't do that because they're afraid that if they move their kids on the wrong side of the border, when a ban comes down, they won't be able to move them back over it. So there is this kind of way in which European expansion also leads to being stuck on one side of the border when you might prefer a border crossing existence for your own family. So those are some thoughts I had about Europe. And I think that you're absolutely right that I just mentioned this kind of revival of global Islamic politics in the 1980s and how that reverberates in German migration policy. You show a few really interesting things that surprised me about how Muslims engaged with citizenship and how they engaged with law in this period. So one, and you alluded to this before, but that they didn't always want citizenship. They didn't see citizenship as something that was going to get them the lives they wanted or protect them from violations of their rights. And so they cling on to this idea of like an Ottoman subjecthood, I think longer than the traditional narrative would have us believe. So that was something I really liked learning about from your book. And then I was also really fascinated by the debate that happens in the 1920s and 1930s about how to best secure Muslim life in these places, and the like number of different concepts of law and concepts of belonging that occur in the 1920s and 1930s. And I'm wondering if you can say more about how you see that debate playing out in the 1920s and 1930s, including with this Islamic legal revivalism that you really beautifully describe in the 30s.
Absolutely. So, I think what happens in Southeastern Europe, unlike in other parts of the former Ottoman Empire, is because Muslims become the minority, they're struggling with sort of, in this moment of emergence of mass politics, they're struggling with what does that mean in terms of their own political identity. Whereas in a lot of other formerly Ottoman areas, like in Turkey, you have the Turkish nation that sort of fills that space. But in places like Yugoslavia, but also in Greece or Bulgaria, right, you have this kind of sense of what does it mean to both be part of a state and to be a citizen, but also sort of to define a new political identity. And what I found was in a lot of places, being an Ottoman was not just a political identity. It was a worldview. It was a framework for thinking. And likewise, being part of an empire was not simply it wasn't just like a political space but it was a way of being. And so we find with a lot of communities in the Balkans, that this Ottoman worldview persists. And that doesn't just mean, we want to be Ottoman, but it means the tools that people were understanding that might be available to them are structured in the ways that they were in the Ottoman Empire. So to give you an example, there's a group of Muslims in Skopje in 1913 who suggest to the British that they should become sort of a neutral, autonomous region. And I don't think that the British fully understood what they were asking for, but autonomy, and this is something historian Amy Janelle's really kind of brought to the forefront here, but autonomy in the Ottoman Empire was a whole political system. It was a political legal system, and it was an arrangement, and it was basically a relationship with this imperial center that allowed regions to have their own kind of economic laws and sort of political structures and even social norms, and develop kind of a regional approach. And so when they're asking for this, right, they're thinking and acting within an Ottoman framework. And so part of what I try to do is, what does that mean then, right? What does it mean when the Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore? That has to go somewhere. And I think what we find, especially after 1923, 1924, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the establishment of modern Turkey, the abolition of the caliphate, is that there's all sorts of movements around the world, Islamic scholars and Muslim politicians trying to kind of fill that space and figure out, like, what does it mean, both nationally, locally, right? And all, I guess not both, but nationally, locally, regionally, and also internationally. And where I go with the story then is I take it into kind of the ways that these international movements and international ideas, particularly around the notion of Islamic legal revivalism, sort of resonate back and help shape local movements. And I think that Islamic legal revivalism gives a lot of language to this feeling of being kind of disenfranchised, of loss, that we were, the Ottoman Empire's gone, of loss in terms of Europeans coming in and feeling kind of invaded and being marginalized in one's own homeland. All of those feelings, there's an effort to kind of create movements within it. And 1920s and 30s is also a moment across Europe where we have the emergence of mass politics. And so I try to look at these two things in conversations and how Muslims were drawing both upon these new movements of mass politics in places like fascist Italy, And the ideas of Islamic legal revivalism that are emerging in other parts of particularly Egypt, but the Middle East, and kind of trying to put them together to create their own path to being a political minority.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's fascinating in your book when we see that there are these ideas of Islamic legal revivalism kind of circulating, but they depend on mass politics and the kind of institutions of mass politics to circulate, so that something that the state is condemning as like backward and a relic of the past is in fact not at all that in how it works out. So that it's actually kind of the most modernized regions in these places that are most attracted to these ideas of legal revivalism. I was really struck by that paradox and the way that the conventional narrative of Muslims in this part of the world doesn't take account of that.
Mm-hmm. I have a lot more questions, but I think we should probably open it up to the audience. Erin, what do you think? Should we keep going, or do you want to open it up to the audience? And then
we have a few questions from the audience. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Cox with Oxford University Press, and I'm the question asker for our conversation today. So we have one question here in the chat from Eli Rubin asking, why were employers so keen on employing entire families, and what kinds of discussions happen behind the scenes between employers or their political representatives and the state per se about this?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Eli. I think the main thing, the single most important thing here is that the West German family policy is that West German mothers belong in the home. That if at all possible, a West German woman who is a mother should be a housewife who is taking care of her husband and taking care of her children. The thing about employers is that employers still want to employ women, but they're finding it very hard to employ German women because German family policy is not really enabling that. And so they are pounding down the door of the labor ministry saying, we've heard there's foreign women in these other countries. Could you facilitate the movement of foreign women here? And the easiest way to get a hold of foreign women is to get a hold of entire foreign families. A lot of these countries actually had laws regulating the emigration of single women. So in Spain, for instance, a woman who wanted to emigrate alone had to get her closest male relatives permission to do so. So women are often being kind of recruited with their husbands or with their brothers or something like that. So there's this very strange paradox by the end of the 1960s and early 1970s where a woman who signs up to work in Germany, in Turkey, or elsewhere, she signs up, she'll be on an airplane or a train to Germany within a couple of weeks. A man who signs up by this point, there's such a long waiting list that man might be waiting 18 months to 2 years to go to Germany and start work as a guest worker. So women are actually the pioneer migrants in a lot of cases, and it's entirely because of an imbalance in what West German employers want to hire. But every time that the labor ministry kind of says, is employing families, is kind of having a very liberal family reunification policy good? Are we getting to get into problems here? Employers push back and they say, if we don't employ families, we can't have women, and we need women. So that was really eye-opening for me, and just important to see like how, if we don't look at employers' demand for female labor in particular, we really can't understand anything that happens later.
Did that cause conflict between German women and migrant women who were coming in?
That's a good question. I didn't see a lot of records of kind of conflict between German women and foreign women. One conflict it immediately caused was about childcare. So women are coming to work in Germany. Women are bringing their children with them to work in Germany. And then women, because they are working full time, and that is why they are in Germany, need somebody to look after their children while they're at work. And so I did see a lot of conflicts in terms of, do these foreign children now have the right to take up places in kindergartens, in creches, in schools? And so one story that the book tells is how the kind of first big court case that allows for family reunification is based on a woman who wants to bring her mother with her to look after her child while she's at work. And the state ultimately decides, well, that's great. A grandmother is a much cheaper solution for childcare than us opening up a place in a kindergarten for this child. And so it's this ability to provide childcare that actually becomes this conflict for the state, and then that becomes another nice thing that families can do, provide childcare. So I don't think they anticipated what that would become when that court case first went to court, but it was a really useful tool for families to use to be able to say, well, look at all of the useful things we can do. Look at all this reproductive labor the family can do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is really fascinating to me, sort of the distinction of family values and what that concept means when applied to different people, right? So and we can see that also, in your case, we have it with like the family values of the German nation versus what they want the values to be of their foreigner workers who come in. And we see the same thing in Southeastern Europe, where the kind of idea of sort of the Muslim woman at home is understood as somehow, medieval and needs to be emancipated, right? But at different points, the Christian woman at home is, embodying the nation, and she's the mother, of the nation. And so you realize that, the imposition of what this concept of family values means and is looked differently at different groups.
Right. Yeah. So in my book, and there's a continuity between our two books in terms of thinking about like, what does in both cases, the states are very concerned about like what the Muslim woman means about her community and about her community's ability to fit into a state building project. But yes, the West German Constitution, the basic law, has Article 6, marriage and the family enjoy the special protection of the state, which seems self-evident, but is not at all, because what is marriage? What is the family? Which states does the family which families does the state want to protect, and which is it more invested in not protecting?
Yeah.
Well, and you'd mentioned sort of Catholicism in there as well. So, sort of what role does Catholicism play in sort of the discussions of inclusion and exclusion sort of across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question. One interesting thing about West Germany is kind of it's West Germany. East Germany has been carved out. And because East Germany is a predominantly Protestant part of what had been Germany, West Germany is the first German state to have a roughly 50-50 Catholic Protestant split. So it is this moment where Catholics and Protestants are being forced to kind of include Catholics in their vision of what the German nation is, right? German nationalism up to that point had historically been pretty Protestant. But when they look at foreign Catholics from Spain and Italy, that's a more fraught process than I think we've recognized up to this point. My book only touches on it in a few points, but I was always fascinated when I came across something in the archives that really dwelled on the difference of foreign Catholics and how foreign Catholics weren't like our German Catholics. And there's reasons for that, right? Especially thinking about Franco's regime, National Catholicism under Franco is different legally, does have a very different set of laws about what you can do with marriage and divorce. But again, it's surprising because I think we think today, Europe's always had a problem with Muslims and no problems with Protestants and Catholics getting along. And that's not true as recently as the 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at other places right now, right? But in Germany, I was shocked to see the amount of strange discourse about Catholicism I did in the 1960s.
And also tensions between Catholics and Orthodox Christians.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in your kind of region, did you see discussion about that in your work?
I mean, in World War II, especially, yes. But in earlier periods, I just wasn't looking for it.
Sure.
Here's another question. What were the challenges from moving between the level of individuals and families and communities and the level of national governments and their domestic and foreign policies? I think in the writing and research.
Emily, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, my own challenge was that, especially in earlier periods, I don't have documents created by Muslim families. And so I have to find those voices through state structured narratives and institutions. So, for example, court records, right? A woman who burns down her husband's house because then she can prove definitively that he can't provide for her, which is a reason why you can get divorced, according to Sharia law, right? So these kinds of things, I'm finding her story through state institutions. So there's a constant back and forth for me between the two. And I think that that's a challenge that historians face when they're working on earlier periods and also periods and places where you're looking at people who are predominantly illiterate. I'm dealing with similar challenges right now with Christian peasant women in the mid 19th century in the region. So it's not a Muslim Christian thing. It's just a sort of education and mass literacy thing. And and so that's kind of where I find the biggest challenge. And in the writing, I try to move back and forth between them to always create sort of story-centered narratives so people can kind of latch onto
it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like you're thinking about Juzida and you're thinking about, Mustafa or Muhammad. And then you're taking that and think, oh, okay, now this is the story that you're trying to tell. But to actually, I feel like it's easier as readers to kind of feel like
humanizing.
Human. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I also, even though I'm working on a later period, there are moments where you come across individual families and state records, and this is the only time that you're able to access them. You don't know what happened to them after this court case or after this moment when they were being investigated by the state, and you really want to know. So that was something I struggled with, kind of losing trace of families, but also just watching families and states talk to each other was really fascinating, because what was happening for so much of my book was that people were getting into Germany, getting their kind of legal permission to live in Germany based on their family relationships. But that tells you about what some pieces of paper say about your family relationship. It doesn't really tell you whether you actually get along with the family members who are facilitating your entry into this new place. It doesn't really tell you how your own family divides labor within the household. And so thinking about kind of how families appear to the state and then how families actually work internally was really fascinating to me. One of my favorite parts in the book is about whether husbands are family members in the kind of definition offered by the West German state in the 1970s. And so I had a couple of husbands who wanted to come and join their wives as family members. And husbands are like, by definition, family members, right? That is in the name. That is a tautology to say that a husband is a family member. But the state would deny these guys entry into the state because they would say a husband has to work. A husband has to be the primary worker for his family, the primary person who earns wages for his family. And you're claiming that you're going to join your wife and do childcare? We don't believe that for a second. So you get these moments where the state is excluding family members, saying, we don't believe you're going to divide up the household labor in the way you say you're going to. And that was really striking for me, just to think about how stressful this must have been for these families who were trying to prove that they were the right kind of family.
Yeah. Well, that sort of leads into a question on Facebook, sort of asking, can you address sort of the guest worker idea and the phenomenon within the context of changing atmospheres between the culture of origin and the culture of FRG?
I can.
So women's rights, LGBT sets of beliefs.
Yeah. So one thing that's really interesting here is how migration law tends to lag family law itself. So marriage law reform happens in West Germany, allowing women to work outside of the household without their husband's permission, allowing, liberalizing divorce, things like this. And that happens domestically in German law, but it takes some time for that to percolate out for migration law. So migration law literally forces migrating families to lag behind what is happening domestically. So even if we're thinking about different cultural change and how cultural change happens across borders, we also have to think about how domestic law may actually be more liberal than migration law in terms of who it laws in the country. The same is the case with queer couples, right? Queer couples could be in Germany legally before queer couples could migrate across borders legally. Mm-hmm. So if we think like, oh, the migrant family is straight and heterosexual, that's kind of an artifact of the fact that gay migrants weren't allowed to use that status to migrate for a really long time. That's partially an artifact of that. So that was one thing I found really interesting. And then politicians will often today claim that one of the reasons migration is bad from some politicians' perspectives is because it allows in people who have non-European gender values.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that's why I made that face. I was like, what?
Right. But I mean, what I really valued about doing the research for this book was it showed how recently won anything called a European gender value is, and how 10 years before, 10 years before, this husband who said he was going to do childcare couldn't come to West Germany because husbands don't do childcare. So who exactly is enforcing European gender values here? I think there's a way in which as soon as value change happens around gender, suddenly somebody has to be backwards, and it might be a scapegoated foreigner. So hopefully that answers the question somewhat.
Yeah, for sure. So we just have a few minutes left. I'm going to ask one last question. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered in your research, or or if you've already said that, what is the thing that people have responded to that you were surprised by? The response to. Maybe I should have sent this question to you. Sorry.
I think I'm going to pick up on, it's not the most, but maybe one of the most surprising things. And it just connects to what Lauren was just saying. And so I think it could be a nice way to end. But one of the most surprising things for me was the ways that women became written out of citizenship. There's an example from 1915. I have this great case of a family who are Serbian citizens, and they're Muslim, and they go to the Serbian government and they say, our daughter was kidnapped, right? And it's not quite clear if she was kidnapped or if she ran away and got married. And so, they investigate, and the state comes back and says, because it's not clear whether she actually ran away or got married, and marriage falls under Islamic law, then you need to, she belongs to the community, the Islamic community, and you need to go to the mufti in charge. And if there is none, which there isn't because it's a war, it's World War I, right? Then the elders. And so they basically give up any obligation to the woman because of the ways that citizenship, and they do it legally. They're like working through all the laws, but because of the way the legal system is set up. And so I think, one of the things that both of our books have in common, and that was surprising to me, was sort of thinking about the ways that even in moments where we think about people having certain kinds of rights, women are often, the legal system is set up in a way that strips them actually of those rights. And I was writing a book about Muslims, and I was constantly sort of surprised and frustrated by Muslim women having a completely different standard of protection.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, I've said a few things that have surprised me, I think, in my answers to other questions. So just full of surprises. Read the book.
I love it. It's
but one of that definitely was when I family was my organizing term for my research. I would go to archivists. I would go around and say, I'm working on a book about the family. And people always assumed that the family meant women. Archivists would say, oh, you're working on the family. We have a lot of boxes that are about foreign women. Here you go. And for a very long time, I thought, yeah, women are the family. That's what happens. So for me, finding that the question of whether men can actually even make use of family reunification law was so contested, and realizing that, like, for a foreign man to claim migration based on a family relationship, every time that happened, the state had a kind of category crisis and freaked out and had to figure out how to make men not really family members again. And so I ended up writing about men much more than I expected to, but I think that was a really important story for understanding how all of this worked.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have 2 minutes left. Do you have any last thoughts? Anything else you want our audience to take away from this conversation or about your books?
I think they work really well in conversation with each other. I look forward to hearing more people think about them together, because I do think that they work really well.
Yeah, I think they're both about Europe kind of defining itself against itself in really profound ways. And I think they're both about how minorities within Europe have used the law creatively and sometimes against how the state expected them to. And so I think they work together thematically really nicely.
And they both challenge the idea of what if Europe as having a singular form of values.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people should buy them together, read them together. There we go.
They look nice together too.
They look nice together too. It's true.
You should do a bundled discount.
We'll do that. Sure. Thank you both. This was so interesting, and I'm sure I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody in our audience learned a lot too. And thank you very much for being a part of the OUP History Book Club. And I hope everybody will tune in for our next one in May.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.